Welcome back to ThinkTech. This is Keeping the World Company. My co-host, Tim Apicella, joins us today, and we have a special esteemed guest, Gerald Gahima, who is from Rwanda, but who is in Washington right now. Welcome to the show, Tim, Gerald. So we're going to talk about the devolution of the coup in Niger, which is actually more and more in the news. And if the average American wasn't aware of it before, she's certainly becoming aware of it now. And there are so many factors, so complicated, and the risks are so great. We really have to study it. We have to see how it affects Sub-Saharan Africa and ultimately the United States and the EU. So let's see, where do we get the environment? Tim, can you give us the environment as far as you see it? And then we'll get some opinions from Gerald.
Sure. As far as I see it, this has been a slow rolling event. I remember back in the early 90s in Tanzania, where there was concern from various communities in Tanzania, particularly the Christians, that they were seeing a militant Islamic influence through education in Tanzania. That was free education. And there was concern back in 1994 about these kind of things. And over the years, we've seen the influence of more extremists from militants. And I suppose that's why we're here now with 1,100 troops in Niger. What are they doing there? Remember a couple of years ago, we had a few troops killed through an attack. And most here in America said, what troops? What are we doing there? No one had a clue that we had U.S. troops positioned there. And why were they there? Well, trying to keep basically an eye on what kind of extremist activities going on in West Africa and other parts of Africa. So that's my take on the background. It's been a slow-moving event to replace some democracies. Certainly, Russia has a hand in this, but that's my take. I wait and anticipate Gerald's take on this whole thing.
Yeah, I'd like to show a map at this point of what the French equatorial Sub-Saharan Africa looks like, the Sahel, they call it. And this map will show that the countries in the Sahel go all the way from the Atlantic Ocean to the Red Sea. So let's talk about, the devolution, if you will. I say that, Gerald, because it looks like, although there was some support for Mohamed Bazoum right after the coup, that has devolved, and it is not so strong. And in fact, there was some kind of fundraising concert in one of the other countries nearby recently to support the coup. And there are protests to support the coup. So, everybody's got a hand in the pie here, and it's complicated, isn't it?
First of all, to add to what my colleague said, we do not just have troops in Niger, but more importantly, we have drones, because these days wars are not fought by just men. And these assets, American, French, European, and the armies of those countries are battering a jihadist insurgency. As I was mentioning just before we started, the situation is worse in some countries than in others. When the government in Burkina Faso was overthrown, the insurgents were controlling more than 40% of the country. And schools were closed, hospitals. So this brings up resentment against the government, because you're in power, you're answerable for the failures of the government, of its army, of its security forces. And these are the problems that these governments are facing. But also, in Niger, the situation was not as acute. I think the government was doing a better job. Sometimes coups are just opportunities for power seekers. Some of the things I've read indicate that the the person who has taken over now, who was the head of the presidential guard, was about to be removed, and that he may have taken the opportunity to take over because he feared losing power.
Mm.
That's one of the causes the likely causes in Niger. But broadly, governments have been weak. Some have been corrupt. The armies have not been down to wipe out the insurgency with severe consequences for the population. And then these are poor countries. War and instability enhances economic problems. And as people become poor and they're not able to afford livelihoods, where can they turn against but the government? And once a government is unpopular, information at the fingertips. So one coup in one country sets an example for military people in another. And that's why we are seeing this cascade of coups in the region.
So many factors. And these insurgents are ISIS and Al Qaeda and Boko Haram too, and they're really brutal. They go into a village which has no defense, no protection, and they destroy it. And they kill the animals, and sometimes the people, many times the people, and they force them out. And so the village is essentially pillaged, but there's nobody to help protect them. And so the French, which are, largely the colonial or former colonial power in the Sahel, aren't to be found. They can't protect these people, and they support the governments, but the governments are not strong enough to protect these people. And I would get ticked off myself if I saw all these villages being destroyed. And the economy has essentially been destroyed. And this is a good reason for all the migration that's been happening. If you're hungry, you move north, you cross the Sahara, and you move north and you try to go to the EU. What is really remarkable, and I would like your comment about it, Gerald, is this is, in a sense, this is a result of climate change, because the Sahara is moving south and temperatures are rising by 1.5 times per annum. And you can't grow anything there. And all of the United Nations efforts to make, the Sub-Saharan area green again, as it was before, have failed. So the result is it's a desert. These people find themselves in a desert. Their water has dried up. Their lakes have dried up. They used to have agriculture and even fishing. That's not possible. So their economies have dried up. How much of this do you put on climate change?
It is a factor. It is a factor, but at this time, not a very strong factor. I would think the main problem is weak institutions, weak, particularly security institutions, armies that are not able to fight the insurgency effectively, occasionally corrupt leadership, and resentment against the former colonial power. There is no love lost between the former colonies, the peoples of the former colonies, and the colonizers. There's a difference between the people and their government. The colonizers work with the governments, but when people are poor and hungry, they blame their government and they turn against the government and its friends.
Well, Tim, where do you think this is going? It's complicated, but all the vectors, seem to be going into negative directions, including Vladimir Putin and Evgeny Prigozhin, who have a big presence and who are actively engaged with the other governments and very likely the junta, in Niger. they are working hard to develop relationships and, in some cases, to destabilize. Where is all that going?
Well, round and around it appears. I hear that there was an express threat that it was a 1 week timeline that if the president Mohamed Bazoum was not put back in office, that the economic community of Western African states, i.e., the military part of that, the combined military efforts of France and the United States, would intercede. They would get involved. That deadline has passed, so nothing has come of it. From my readings, I understand that the president of Algeria says, let's not repeat the mistakes that we did back in Libya, because the after effects of Libya is still apparent in the Saharan part of Africa, that those countries still suffer from that intervention. And so it's a question of if or when the president would be put back into power. He's being accused of treason, and allegedly he's going to go to trial for treason. So I think things are in flux. Clearly, I'm sure that the United States and other countries will try some diplomatic effort to calm this thing down. But with Putin's influence, those efforts will be thwarted, I think.
Gerald, do you agree? What's going to happen here? It doesn't look very optimistic.
As an African, and I hate to say this when I'm in the US, intervention in Libya was a disaster.
Mm-hmm.
Africa is worse off, and Libya is worse off now than it was under Gaddafi. You at least had one country and one man you could threaten. Now the place is total chaos. And it's a bad neighborhood. It's not just Libya that has broken into pieces. Sudan is following the same path. So we don't need another failed state. We don't need another Somalia in West Africa. I would rather have a military dictatorship than have a completely failed state. So what I would expect the US, what I would advise personally the US and France and other countries, is to use soft power instead, to use sanctions, to withhold aid. Russia is in a mess on its own. It doesn't really have much to offer. I think there can be soft power ways of turning these countries around and agreeing not maybe on an immediate power transfer, but on a roadmap for the return of civilian rule.
You know, one of the issues that has been written about, Gerald, is that if the United States calls this a coup, and it hasn't yet described it, characterized it as a coup, then it has to stop providing economic, support for the junta, and so it is reluctant to call it a coup. But what kind of economic support are we talking about? Is that meaningful? And the sanctions, could they be meaningful? I mean, we have seen sanctions play. Let's call it sanctions play in Ukraine, and it's hard to say how meaningful that's been. And then, of course, there's the whole EU thing, and Macron is very interested in Niger because of the uranium and other resources. So what can he do? Are you suggesting the same thing for him?
Well, first of all, for the US, if they call it a coup, they would not only have to stop economic aid, but they would also have to stop military cooperation. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't make sense because those jihadists will still be there, whether you have an agreement with Niger or not. So I think it's very important for the US, whether there is a coup or not, whether they call it a coup, whatever they call it, they need to stay on the ground, reach some accommodation with whoever has power in that country so that they can be able to continue to play a role in fighting back against the insurgency, particularly since France is being pushed out of all these countries. It appears to me like the US is the only country that still has a chance to be able to work with these countries to fight back against the insurgency.
Let me just tag on to that, if I may. Remember, if sanctions occur, be it military or economic, remember that's what's created from that, and that's a vacuum. And who would love to fill the vacuum? The absence of any influence from either the EU or the United States. Who would like to fill that vacuum? And I'm sure that your guess is as good as mine. It would be Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, but as Gerald says, Putin has other issues elsewhere. He may not have the economic twist to do all that much, but he would be motivated, wouldn't he, Gerald? He'd be motivated because of the resources. And my feeling is that when Putin met with Prigozhin in Belarus after the insurrection in Russia by Prigozhin, and they made a deal, which is secret. But one of those elements of that deal, I believe, had to do with who controls the Sahel. Now they're apparently working together, aren't they, in the Sahel, Prigozhin and Putin, for propaganda on the one side and for minerals, and the Wagner group on the other side for violence. So they do have a certain amount of interest there. And if there is, substantial uranium in Niger and other countries around it, I'm thinking of Mali, then that's of value to Putin, who fancies himself a nuclear power.
Absolutely, and he does not need to spend rubles. I don't think he has many dollars left, but he can let the Wagner group reach its own agreements with these governments, and they would pay with minerals. And it's not just in Mali or Niger. In Sudan, one of the warring parties is paying the Wagner group by giving them gold mining rights. The Wagner group is doing the same in the Central African Republic, giving them gold mines and diamond mines. So there are opportunities for Putin to do mischief. I think we should not lightly dismiss him. He's able to be a spoiler in many countries.
Can we see that map again? On that map, you're from Rwanda, which is on the eastern side of all of that, not at least on this map, it's not included as part of the Sahel.
It's so small.
Small,
yet mighty.
But yet mighty.
In Rwanda, it's Tanzania, Congo, and Uganda.
So on that map, you have the possibility, and you mentioned this earlier, that this could be a kind of cornerstone of democracy. I think it's clear from the news anyway that Niger was a showcase for democracy, and that Bazoum was a showcase for an enlightened leader. So if he fails, and it sounds like he has failed and he's not coming back, and God knows what will happen when they try him for treason. But there are other countries will be affected. Every country on that map in Sub-Saharan Africa will be affected. And it's like perhaps a domino effect, that one exacerbates the problems in the next, and so on and so forth. What are your thoughts about that possibility?
I think that zone is particularly vulnerable to coups. I don't think the coups will spread much further. At the end of the day, one of the reasons why these governments are being overthrown is because people are unhappy about them. They're unhappy that they're imprisoning journalists, they are imprisoning opposition leaders, they are corrupt. So under military government will only be worse in every respect. So there will still be a clamor for democracy. I think it will be difficult for many militaries in most African countries to carry out coups in this day and age. But what happens, you have countries that are nominally democratic, but authoritarian in character. So they still have elections, but the elections are manipulated. So I don't think there will be many more coups outside that region, but there will still be governments that are only nominally democratic.
Yeah, some of the other countries in the southwest of the western part of the Sahel indicated that they were planning, as Tim said, to send forces into Niger and try to restore the power to Bazoum. You think there's any chance of that?
I read somewhere yesterday that even the OAU is now opposed to that kind of military intervention, the African Union. So I think it's unlikely that there will be an intervention. I believe it would be advised. I recommend personally that countries, especially the United States, that have a lot of leverage, should seek to exert that leverage to agree on a roadmap for a return to democracy. Because think of it this way: assume there is a war to overthrow that government. There are still military governments in Mali and Burkina Faso and in Chad and in Sudan. Are you going to attack all those countries too?
I don't have a weapon. Sorry.
And
your mind is a weapon, Jay. Your mind.
How does the war against the jihadists continue while this attempt to remove that government is also in power? The war to remove that military government is going on.
You know, Tim, we've had a number of shows on Africa and the Sub-Saharan Belt like this in various countries, especially including Sudan, South Sudan. And, you know, we here at ThinkTech have become, you know, through Project Expedite Justice and all that, you know, we've learned about it. But I don't think the American public knows much about it. You mentioned that everybody was surprised to find American troops were there a few years ago and were actually killed in an action. The question is, how does this play politically? Because I think we can predict there'll be more violence. There is a lot of violence we don't even know about. And there'll be more violence, and it plays in similar fashion in a number of countries. And now Niger will join in that violence, and Vladimir Putin and Prigozhin are all too happy to foment that violence. And they will claim that they're helping, but they're not helping at all. And then, you know, Sudan hasn't been resolved. You know, the whole area is kind of aflame. How does that play politically in the United States? It will become known.
Right. Well, you know, when you say how does it play politically, I think when it comes to politics, it's not necessarily always what you did, but what did you not do? What did you miss? What was the obvious that you missed? And no matter who the president is, they take the hit for something going on that wasn't even conceived of or thought of. So let's look at the interest of why countries are interested in being there. Well, obviously, it's the Islamic militant issue is the obvious. But remember during the Bush administration, Niger there was a false report that yellow cake was being exported to Iraq. And that got the attention of many Americans. You mean uranium is being shipped to these rogue countries in the Middle East? Oh my gosh, how could that happen? So it's part of the chess game, is that you've got to make sure, or at least from the United States interest, self-interest, is you have to make sure that these governments are somewhat stable so that there isn't the export of uranium to the next Iran or the next, God knows, North Korea for enrichment of that uranium. So it's a big chess game. So it's the proactive moves. That's our interest, I think. France, their interest, obviously, is that 68% of their energy, their power, is derived from nuclear power. So they're looking constantly for uranium. So we all have our own interests, and that's how it plays politically.
How much of this do you blame on France, Gerald?
France, in fairness, I think they've...
Most of these countries are French-speaking. They were French colonies.
But I would not blame the instability in the Sahel on France. No, I think they've tried to do the best they could. They have not got it right. As an imperial power, former imperial power, I think they come with a degree of arrogance, but I think they've shown a commitment to fighting the insurgency in West Africa. They've devoted significant resources to that war for many years. So I would hesitate to blame France for this instability.
There's been reports that they're leaving. They're leaving Niger. And this is problematic, and I wonder, what effect that has on the junta, on the coup, and on the what do you want to call it, the devolution of the country by the coup.
They're leaving Niger. They've been thrown out of Mali. My view is that these are ill-advised decisions by those militaries, because if they've been unable to stand up to the insurgency and to stop it with the assistance of France and the United States, how on earth are they going to stand up to these insurgencies on their own?
If there were no instability, if these places, Niger, one among at least half a dozen, toward the Atlantic, in West Africa there, could be stabilized, could have stable governments, didn't have insurrection, and didn't have protest, and didn't have killing by the jihadists. If they could actually get down to making an economy, that would go a long way, because what's missing in all of them, these are some of the poorest countries, regions in the world. It's really too bad that they spend their time killing each other. If they could just stop doing that, they could have an economy. So, Tim, what is the solution? Is it that? Is it simply to stop that? How important is that in terms of building an economy in this part of the world? And what happens if we don't?
Well, I remember the Bill Clinton initiatives back in the day that to encourage foreign investment in South Africa and other nations in Africa. And it was a very good idea, because economic prosperity is just that, it's prosperity. So you have an opportunity to address those issues of famine, water droughts, real problems in certain points of Africa. And so military is not always the best solution. In fact, military, as we talked about Libya, it still has adverse ramifications and ripples through the neighboring nations to Libya. So your solution it always comes down to this: it's money and investment. And I don't know if that's going to be forthcoming, particularly when there's going to be a strain on climate change and the adverse impacts of what that's going to, the toll of that's going to be on many nations in Africa, and how much more money will it take to try to offset that. So you asked me for a solution when we're out of time, Jay, and I don't have one.
Well, let me put this to you, Gerald. One thing this coup does, and the attitudes taken by the junta, is it discourages foreign investment. But foreign investment may be a key to the survival of civil society and the economy of Niger. That's really tragic, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's not just foreign investment. it's also domestic investment. If you are from Niger and you have $1 million, you are not going to invest it in Niger. You'll find a way of investing it in another country.
Yeah. One last question, Gerald. We've been talking about, how one country affects the other, and they're all kind of brothers and sisters in this belt across Africa. There's a certain amount of, I don't want to call it trade, but relationships between, the West and the East of the Sahel. What about the south of the Sahel? You have a green belt south of the Sahel. There's a lot of countries that don't have these environmental problems. They have water. They have agriculture. They can have animals, and the animals will survive because it's not drought. Is it possible that this malaise that is happening in the Sahel will go south, and that there will be instability in the countries that are south of the Sahel Belt?
I'm a lawyer, not a political analyst. I would hesitate to answer that guess. But as I said, I don't see a cascade of coups across Africa as a result of what is happening in the Sahel. I see a situation where we continue to have nominal democracies in many countries where elections are not free and fair. But no, I don't think that these coups will spread to other countries further south.
Okay. We're almost out of time. As Tim suggests, I'd like to call for final comments. Tim, you're first.
Thanks, Jay. Of recent, we've been getting comparisons from our Republican friends that what's the deal of spending all of these billions of dollars in Ukraine when we're not giving only $700 per person in Maui in the fires of Lahaina. These comparisons, and Trump is a master at it, is why are we sending money to all these nations when we're not appreciated, around the world? And so this rhetoric, this propaganda takes place. The United States and the world and France can't afford to be apathetic when it comes to issues in Africa. We have to stay engaged. We can't afford to be apathetic and just take the ball home and pretend it doesn't exist, because sooner or later it will impact us. It'll impact the Middle East. It will impact the EU as far as migration. And there's ripple effects from apathy. And it's my hope that we stay engaged. We become a partner in many African nations, and we recognize it for what it is, a very important partner in the world community.
Thank you, Tim. Great comments. Gerald, what would you like to leave with our viewers? What message would you like to leave? What are your final thoughts to express here?
My final thought, I believe that for Niger, I believe that it's very important for the US government to continue to get engaged to deal with the jihadist problem there. And I believe that it's better to try soft power and to avoid war in that region. It's like you talk of racism in the US, for example. You have a bad history, but the trajectory has been in the right direction. So even for war and conflict, there may be dictatorship and war in Africa, but the trajectory is in the right direction. When I was growing up in the 60s and the 70s, if you look at that whole map, every government in Africa was a military dictatorship. In most of them, by the constitution, presidents would be presidents for life. Now, maybe half of the countries hold regular, fair, free elections. And even in the countries that also are authoritarian, the worst of the human rights abuses that, I don't know how old you are, but when I grew up in a country called Uganda, where the president was called Idi Amin.
Yeah.
He was terrible.
The worst.
Those were bad days for Africa. So, and the situation has changed. When I was even in law school, we did not have a course on human rights. You would read newspapers, killings were going on, but you would see no press coverage of human rights. But things have changed. Civil society is stronger. There are countries that are democratic. Economies we're still poor, but economies have vastly improved. So things are moving in the right direction, although there are setbacks. In Africa, it was the same. In Latin America, it was the same. In Eastern Europe. Well, during our lifetime, we've seen a peaceful transition to democracy.
We see that in the United States, where the progression is never a straight line up. It zigs and zags, particularly with our race issues in this country. It's not a forward progression. We're taking a big step back right now in the last 7 years, thanks to you know who.
The US is now categorized as a less than free country.
Yes.
Isn't that something?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, the question really is whether we're on the zig or the zag.
True. And which way is up and which way is down on the zig and the zag?
The important thing is the trajectory.
Gerald Gahima and Tim Apicella for a very important and thoughtful discussion. Aloha.
Thank you so much.
Aloha.